Good day. This is our Wednesday sermon series as we continue on in Genesis. And obviously, again, if you're watching this, we're just continuing to invite you to be a part of this journey as we go through the book of Genesis. If you're catching us on Sundays, we're doing various chapters, and on Wednesdays, we're picking up on other chapters, all in an effort to kind of keep a good pace with this book. So today in our Genesis series, we're going to be looking at two chapters, chapter 16 and chapter 17 today. So if you have a Bible, I want to encourage you to have it open, ready, turn it on, whatever it is, and we're going to go through chapter 16 and chapter 17. As we do so today, we're going to encounter now this part of Abram's story. Now, let me just set us up again. Abram has had this wonderful conversation with God where God has shown up to him and he has promised Abram, the land, I will give you a child, I'm going to make your name great. He's promised Abram the same thing that he promised at the very beginning of his faith journey. And what we're going to see is Abram's journey of faith. It starts off shallow. He's learning to trust God. He's making mistakes along the way. And so now he has this great moment where God has appeared and given his promise to Abram. The promise is from God. It's going to be kept by God. And Abram has nothing else to contribute to the promise other than he just has to trust and believe in God. So chapter 16 is going to pick up after having this great God experience. What's going to happen? Now, typically, we hope in our own way when we experience God, somehow what's to follow is that we will have a deeper faith, we will have a greater trust of God, and we will follow through in proper and better action. Well, let's look at what Abram and Sarai do. In chapter 16, it starts off simply by saying this. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. Again, we remember she's been not able to have kids, and yet there's a promise that somehow they're going to have kids. But she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Now again, Egyptian slave. She was the one they picked up when Abraham first messed up, that they had gone beyond the promised land into the fertile land of Egypt. And from there, Abraham had lied and left his wife to the Pharaoh. Well, then Pharaoh got in trouble with God, and he sent them packing, and he gave them a bunch of things, property to go with it. And so this is an Egyptian slave that's probably part of the package deal that Pharaoh gave them to get out of his presence. So maybe that's something for us to consider is, don't forget sometimes our sin, we may not experience the consequences of it right away, but it may come back to bite us simply because of the damage that sin can do. So that's something for us to think about. But here in verse 2, so she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. And so rather than trust in a God who has now shown himself and made a promise to Abram, now he's not listening to God anymore. What is he doing? He's listening to his wife, and they're going to take matters into their own hands. And the question that I have for us isn't this often a tale of how we respond to God? We can have these great moments where we encounter God. Maybe it's at a church service, or maybe it's at a particular Christian gathering, or maybe God has just shown up in a tremendous way in your workplace or in a conversation with someone. And rather than having that deepen our faith and having that increase our trust in God, the next action we take, the next time we're put to the test, we take matters into our own hands. And so Sarai and Abram are no different from us. Now, this isn't a commentary on marriage or women or anything like that. But again, we do have a parallel here that we can see. When in the beginning, when Adam and Eve had sinned against God, Eve did not listen to the instructions that God had given Adam. And she broke God's commands and gave it to her husband, who remained silent. In this, you have a very similar thing where God has promised Abram, but Sarah is now taking matters into her own hands, and she's going to do something. She's going to propose something, and Abram remains silent. And so, she starts off by saying things that aren't necessarily true of God. God, you haven't done this. You haven't done this, right? And it's a very simple parallel, again, back to the story of Adam and Eve, where, the serpent was tempting Eve, and she just didn't follow through with what God was saying. And God again, says there are things that we say on behalf of God that aren't necessarily true, much like in Eve and now in Sarai. And I just think sometimes even in our own Christian faith, there are a lot of things that we say to one another as Christians that aren't necessarily true. Like, for example, one of the things that sticks out most is God helps those who help themselves. That is nowhere in your scripture. That is actually antithetical to what your scripture says all the time. God actually doesn't help those who help themselves. God actually helps those who cannot help themselves, in fact. So at this point, Abraham and Sarai, they are now trying to take matters into their hands. God, you've made a promise, but God, maybe you're too busy, or God, maybe you're not moving as quickly as we like, or God, are you sure? Because you don't need our help because you made the promise for yourself. Are you sure you don't need our help? Well, let's get the ball rolling for you, God. And so here's where they overstep. They take things into their own hands, and rather than trust God that God would provide them a child, they then go on this path of maybe what we would call modern day surrogacy. Here is my Egyptian slave, Abraham, why don't you sleep with her and maybe you will have a child with her. And so this is how they then go about this. At this point, Sarai, just try to think of this. She's 75 years old. She's not getting any younger. She's well past the childbearing age, and she's thinking the promises of God are not going to happen through me. God, you're promising a child. Clearly I'm not getting younger. It's not going to happen through me. So let's find the loophole. Let's find the technicality. Maybe God, you've been promising Abraham, you're going to have a child. So it's going to come through Abraham, not through me. So what if he has a child with someone else, right? Now, again, we have looked at this a bit. Abraham has already tried a few things. He's tried to have an adopted child through his nephew Lot. Now he's going to try this surrogate path, and again, it's just not going to work out the way it's supposed to. So again, this is Hagar, who's given over. She's the property of Sarai. She pretty much has to do what her master tells. She gives Hagar to Abraham, much like in the story of Adam and Eve. Eve gave the fruit to Adam, and he was silent, and he took a bite. So they've been waiting now for about 11 years for God to promise to be fulfilled about having a child. Let's take matters into our own hand. Now, what we find after this is that Abraham agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abraham had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with her, and she conceived. And when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. So at this point, now she's able to conceive. What this means then is Sarai's worst thoughts have come to fruition. Again, in a culture back then where the idea of being blessed and cursed was important, a woman who had many children or who could have children was considered a blessed person, but a woman who couldn't have children of her own, she was considered cursed. And now what she knows is this: between her and Abraham, she's the problem. Sarai is the problem, because Abraham was able to conceive with another woman. That means me, Sarai, I'm the problem. I'm the one who's been cursed. And so now she is frustrated. She's just completely shamed at this point, and she's completely feeling the cultural baggage of this curse. And so she resents Hagar for the very fact that she was able to get pregnant. And then what does she do? She blames Abraham. She blames him. She's like, you are, in verse 5, you are responsible for the wrong that I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. The Lord judge between you and me. See, back when we started this concept of sin between Abraham and Eve, between Adam and Eve, what you have is not only do they fail with what God has commanded, but once it's happened, they blame each other. And here again, you have this same thing. Sarai now blames Abraham. But wasn't it Sarai's plan? Wasn't it her plan to do this? And Abraham just went along with it. And now she's saying, well, you're the reason why. You're the reason why this plan happened. And she's blaming him for it. So it echoes a lot of this Genesis 3 passage. And I just want you to be able to hear some of those echoes. Now, here's the thing that I hope that we can learn and take away from this, is that, again, God has made this tremendous promise to Abraham. He has shown up, and he, in between the carcasses of these split animals, and he's the one who walked through that promise. And again, there was a cultural equivalent of making an oath that it is God alone who's making this promise, and it is God alone who will upkeep it. Why is it then, as people, why do we feel the need to always step in and somehow think we can help God? Why is it we always think that somehow we need to step in and somehow we need to help God? Again, God's plans and his promises are his. We mess it up because we overstep. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 is a very familiar verse for a lot of people. It just simply says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make your path straight. Just trusting in God, and don't lean on what you think. Trust in God. And that's a very important verse, I think, that we can take to heart. There are a lot of things that go on in our life that we cannot control, that we have to trust that God is going to somehow deliver, God is going to come through, or God is going to show up. But too many times we manufacture things for ourselves. We think we are smart, we have capacity, we have ability, and we maybe think, oh, maybe God, you're busy. Let me prod this along. Or God, maybe you're not hearing me, so let me just sort of push it forward again. And so here we have an example of what Abram and Sarai do, and it's no different from a lot of times in how we live. Unfortunately for Hagar, then, she has to run. She feels the need to run away. After all, she was just Sarah's. She was nothing more than property to Abram and Sarah, and she wants to run back and go back to Egypt, to her homeland. And this is where she encounters God. In verse 7, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near the spring in the desert, and it was a spring that is beside the road of Shur. And so she encounters God in this moment. But here's the first mention of an angel. So you have, and he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? She says, I am running away from my mistress Sarah. She answered, then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. This is the first mention of the angel of the Lord. Now, scholars and others can speculate this may be the first instance of the angel Gabriel. We're not sure, but it's in this failure, in this moral failure between Abram and Sarah that's affected now this other person named Hagar. God still shows up. Take a moment to consider that. In the midst of my failure, in the midst of the failures that I have with whomever, God still shows up. And he shows up not to punish, not to condemn. He shows up with grace and with mercy. So she tells him to go back. I see you, I hear you, I will be with you. And says, go back to your house, go back to Sarai, don't run. You will also have a descendant, and you'll call him Ishmael. And so go back because I hear you. See, God sets himself apart. God sets himself apart with a very simple theological expression here in this passage. He says, I hear you and I see you. In a culture where they worshipped so many gods, where they were polytheistic, where they worshipped anything, like a tree would be an idol, a rock could be an idol. And what was the most indicative thing of those things is that these things were deaf and they were mute and they were blind. They cannot see, these gods cannot see, these gods cannot hear, these gods cannot speak. And this is a God who separates himself by saying, I see you, I hear you, and I'm speaking to you. And this is a very, just sort of a key telling point about the relational aspect of God that you and I get to experience even to today. Now, she's going to have this son, and he's going to be the father of also another nation of many descendants. And this is where we have much of our Middle Eastern, Arab, Israeli issues and conflicts that continue to exist today, because this is kind of the root of where it all begins. And if you trace lineages and histories and things like that, you will see pieces of how all of this comes together. But here's the thing, in verse 13, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. Again, this is a God who sees. The personal, relational God who is there. One of the things I think how important seeing and hearing has become. Most of us now, it's so common that we have a device with us, a smartphone with us everywhere we go. I think what grieves me sometimes is when you go back when we used to go to playgrounds, or you go out and about and you're walking the city, or you're just with people at restaurants. A lot of times we're in the presence of someone else, or the kids are running around playing on the playground. You hear them say, Mommy, look what I can do. Daddy, look what I'm doing. And what is mom and dad doing most of the time? They're on their device looking at a screen. And it has a lot to say about being seen and heard. Many of a generation of people who are physically present but don't feel like they are seen and heard. And these smartphones become these dumb idols that we believe in. For some reason, they speak to us, they do see us, and they do hear us in a very, very creepy way. But a real God who's relational is one who sees, hears, and speaks. And it's part of that relational aspect that this God blesses Hagar with who he is and his presence. And so she goes back. She's encouraged by this God. She goes back. Now, what can we take away from chapter 16 here? One of the key factors I think that we need to really grasp in this, again, is God has done this amazing thing. And yet, somehow, we don't fully trust in God. That's the indictment for Sarai, and that's the indictment for Abraham. And the question I think often is for us. God demonstrates so many times, repeated patterns in our lives where he's shown up, he's faithful, he fulfills promises, he reminds us of those promises, those things that say, I love you, I'm there, do not be afraid, I'm with you, all those kinds of promises. I've taken care of your sin, those things. Yet oftentimes, again, we still don't fully trust God, and we take matters into our own hands. Now here's the thing, when God's plans and promises, they're his. We mess it up often when we overstep. The consequences of those oversteps can be tremendous because they not only have bearing on us, they have bearing on anyone else that we come in contact with. So again, my challenge or encouragement to you is this. When God makes his promise, when God reveals to you his plans, really step back. Don't take matters into your own hand. Learn to hear the difference between when I'm supposed to actively do something and when I'm supposed to passively sit and hear God. Oftentimes things like sharing the gospel with people, when we tell others about our faith in Jesus, we somehow think that when I tell them they have to be convinced, I have to convince them. And so we try to convince and we try to manipulate the situation. We try to use the right words and we try to make sure we say the right things and we try to make them come to a decision. That's overstepping because that's not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to share about the good news of Jesus. Whether or not someone believes or is convinced, that's not our responsibility. That's God's promise. That's God's plan. Sometimes for us, it's simply to follow in faith where God is leading us. And so our simple journey, like Abraham, is to follow in faith. We're not sure what this job will entail. We're not sure where we will be living. We're not sure necessarily, but we just trust in God. But we go and we make plans for ourselves and we try to push God to fit this plan. We try to push God's purposes and plans to fit what we hope. So I hope that we can take this lesson from Abraham and Sarai, that in the midst of having this great moment with God, that we would, instead of taking matters into our own hand, learn to continue to deepen and trust God in faith. And that's Genesis 16. Genesis 17 coming up right now. All right, here we are in Genesis 17. It starts off with this. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, now, from the last chapter in chapter 16 to now in chapter 17, we actually have a time jump. We have a time jump of about 13 years. At this point, Abraham is 99 years old. So from the time that what has happened previously, also, that means Ishmael is around 13 years old at this point, his first son that he had with this woman named Hagar. Sarai at this point is about 90 years old. So we have this time jump of about 13 years. I don't know what's going on in those 13 years, how God has been dialoguing with Abraham or how that faith journey is going. Has there been more testing? Has there been more growth? Has there been more development in those 13 years? We don't know. We simply know that it's been 13 years later. We have this time jump. And then God introduces himself. He says, I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. First, let's stop right there. I am God Almighty. This is the term El Shaddai. This is the first time in your scriptures that this term for God is actually used. The Lord God Almighty. The Lord Almighty. It's actually also this idea of the Lord who is the most sufficient one for you. Why am I introducing myself as the most sufficient one? Because I'm going to do something that's going to require you to trust me that I will be sufficient. And so here we have this name. This name El Shaddai actually gets used a lot in the book of Job. So that's something just if you want to just sort of keep in the back of your head. But God is saying, something here. He's like saying, I'm the one who is strong. You're not. I'm God. You're not. I'm the sufficient one. You're not. So here we go. You're going to have to trust me. I'm going to do something that no one else can do. And you're going to have to believe me. So what is he going to do? Well, he instructs Abraham at this point, walk before me faithfully and be blameless. And I just want to just pause there and just sort of pull that apart and understand that a bit. Walk before me faithfully. Again, to trust me. Walk in trust with me. Faith is really trusting that God is who he says he is and living like that. Oftentimes, this is the journey of faith for Abraham. That God is who He says He is, and God is, and he's walking with God that way, and he believes that, and he trusts that. Again, it's not this simple linear progression that a lot of people think, where, oh, I just keep growing and I just keep going. I've always understood faith that it's 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. It's upside down, inside out, this dotted curved line that goes all over the place, because that's our life. It's a messy life. And there are moments that we will succeed in trusting in God. And then there are moments where we just blow it. We will blow it. And again, we just came out of a season of Abraham's story where he blew it. God showed up. He was faithful. He did something. They took matters into their own hands and they made a mess of the situation, and it caused problems between the relationships with one another. And now here God is showing up again, and he's saying, be faithful, trust me, walk with me. And he calls us to that same life. Be faithful, trust me, walk with me. You don't need to know everything. I'm going to be there. I'm with you. I'm doing this. Trust me, and have that. So at the same time, he then uses this other word, be blameless, be blameless. And a lot of times I think we hear that. Let me just pull that apart a bit too. This is not the idea of go and be perfect, or go and be holy, or go and be so great in front of other people. No, the idea of blameless is simply this: live your life in such a way knowing you're in plain view of God. Live your life in such a way that you know you are in plain view of God. Where is God? We understand his omniscience, he's that, and omnipresence and omnipotence. That omnipresence means he's everywhere. So live your life, live my life in such a way that we know God is there, and we're in plain view of him. So those secret things that we like to do that no one else knows. Those secret sins that we'd like to have behind closed doors that not even our closest spouse or our children know that we do. To be blameless is to live life knowing that we are constantly in the presence of God, in plain view of him. So if you wouldn't do that in plain view of God, don't. And that's the calling, that's the challenge here. Think of kids, kids, when they know mommy and daddy's around, they kind of behave a little bit differently. And so you just think that, if we're in plain view of our great Father, are we living life a little bit differently? And if so, be a little more consistent with that. So here's Abraham's history at this point. We have him, he was walking with his family, which is Terah, his dad. Dad was in charge of everything. That's why when he didn't fully leave his homeland, he stopped in a place called Haran and lived there for a while. Then he walks with his servants. He goes past where God has promised into Egypt. And so he's now walking beyond where God wants him to go. He's walking with his nephew at that point. So he was not fully leaving everyone behind. He was hopefully maybe adopting this, and that this person would be his heir and his son. And then he's walked with Sarai, who's offered her Egyptian slave, and they've had a kid now. But this isn't what God is wanting to have happen either. So he's 99. 99. Walking with God is just not this one-time thing. And to walk with God is this whole life, that journey that we're going on. For some of us, we start young. And for some of us, we're just starting. And it doesn't matter what age you are. It doesn't matter what stage you are. It's never too early to walk with God. Abraham's 99. He still has to learn to walk with God, even though he's experienced God in so many different ways. And I don't know how long you've been a follower of God, or if you're just even searching. If you're searching, there's no better time to always start a walk with God. But for those of you who've been walking with God for quite some time, you've never arrived. We constantly and consistently still need to walk with God. So let's pull apart some things that are going to happen here. Abraham, again, his name means exalted father. I think for a period of his life before all this, maybe he was really struggling with his identity. After all, my name means exalted father, and if I was to introduce myself to someone, hey, my name is exalted father, and they say, oh, really great, well, who are your children? I have none. Well, how can you be an exalted father then? And so along this journey, he's probably had some identity issues with regards to that. It's been embarrassing for him. So where are your kids? Well, I don't have kids. And maybe there's some relief now that if someone says, hey, exalted father, where's your kid? Well, here's my son Ishmael. Maybe there is some relief now to his stress in that. But God is going to rename him now. And he gets to have a new name. It's the name that we're more familiar with. He's going to call him Abraham, which means father of multitude, or father of many. So the renaming piece here is important, because the renaming is in the scriptures is always this idea of reestablishing a new identity. It's about reaffirming a promise, or giving a new purpose, or having a new plan for someone, and the assurance that this is God who's renaming him. So it's the one, God is doing this, and God is going to put it to completion. God is the one who's declaring this new promise, and this new promise is going to happen before it even happens, and it's going to stretch him. You're going to be the father of a multitude. I'm renaming you now. I have this plan for you, but it's long before you're ever going to see this. I mean, Abraham, how is he going to be a father of a multitude? He only has one son right now, and it's not fully through his own wife. Well, here's the thing with this. I think one of the things that we can grasp with this is this idea that God is the one who's doing this. Again, this whole narrative of Abraham's life, while we look at his journey of faith and seeing how it grows and stretches, and his successes and failures, we just see a God who's continuing to work in his life, continuing to go behind the scenes. And so now I'm going to give you this new purpose. I'm going to give you this new plan. You're 99, I know. And for some of you, maybe at 65, when you reach that golden age of retirement, you're wondering, God, what am I going to do now? I no longer work. I'm retiring. God says, I still can use you. I still can use you. Some of you are reaching that 80-year plateau. I can still use you. I can still use you. Because Abraham is 99, and I'm going to give him a new plan and a new program and a new purpose. Doesn't matter, because God is the one who's doing it. Doesn't matter what life stage or what age, God is the one who's going to do it. And what's he promising? He's promising Abraham now, he's going to show him this land again. He's going to remind him, I'm promising you this land. Now, in your study guide, there's an image there for you, a map there for you. This is the size of the land. It's about approximately 300,000 square miles. That's the size of British Columbia, maybe slightly bigger than British Columbia. And so I'm promising you all this land. But Israel, unfortunately, they never fully occupy what God promised. At the end of the day, in King Solomon's reign, which was probably after David and Solomon, which was the pinnacle of their culture and their society, they really only occupied 30,000 square miles. So put that into context for you a bit. God promised the size of British Columbia to Abraham. They only ended up occupying the size of Vancouver, and that's it. The size of Vancouver Island. That map is for you in your study guide. But what do I want you to hear from that? I want you to hear how a lot of times when God makes a promise for us, it's far greater than we can think. But so many times we actually shortchange ourselves because we are far too easily satisfied. We are far too easily manipulated in our own thinking and in our own ways, that we end up cutting it short. Again, those promises of God are not just these health, wealth, material things. The promises of God are great in terms of these things of almost the intangible things of faith, of life, of purpose, of value, of meaning. And yet we shortchange ourselves so much. We sabotage ourselves so much because those promises that God gives, we only claim a very small amount of it. And that's just something illustrative of Abraham's life, and it's also something illustrative of our own life. I often think of a quote of C.S. Lewis that, children playing in mud and just being so satisfied with mud piles because they can never think of anything greater and bigger beyond that. And oftentimes we actually shortchange ourselves because we sometimes just don't trust that God will do this. We sometimes just don't believe in what God is telling us. We sometimes don't believe what the Bible tells us. So we end up shortchanging ourselves a lot from the promises of God. And I think that's an illustrative thing for us to consider and remember as we continue on in our faith journey. And so what he's going to do is he changes Abraham's name to Abraham. He changes his wife's name from Sarai to Sarah. And then he establishes a covenant with him. Now, God has already established one covenant. He's going to do something that only he's the promise maker and he's the promise keeper alone. But now here's this other covenant. This is the sign of a covenant. This is now Abraham's part in it, and it's called circumcision. Now, it's this physical thing where they snip off the foreskin of the penis as an outward expression that they are following in God's covenant. Now, it's not something new here. This is something that already had been happening in various parts culturally in Egypt, and it was a common social practice. But this social practice was now given spiritual meaning. the spiritual meaning behind it now is that you are going to be set apart as my people. And it's a sign of a covenant. So the symbolic meaning is this idea, to cut off flesh so it does not control you. And the idea that to cut off the foreskin was the idea of life was being passed on through this. You're born into sin, but you're not going to live in that. You're not bound by that. You're not stuck in that, because now I'm giving you a purpose. There's a plan, there's a covenant, there's a promise that goes beyond that. You're going to have a new life in a new context with God's promises. This idea of circumcision gets later picked up in your New Testament by the Apostle Paul, who would take this image of physical circumcision and say, now it's not just as the circumcision of our heart. That it's not a physical thing, but a spiritual thing, that God is working in our heart, where it's cutting out the sin nature. It's cutting out the garbage in our life. It's cutting out the sin in our life, that we're not stuck to it, we're not bound to it, we're not restrained by it, we're not controlled by it, but now we have freedom and we have a new nature, a spirit nature. And this image of circumcision gets played out in baptism. The idea that this symbolic meaning that it's this outward sign of a covenant of God and his people. It's this outward sign now. Like many things, our symbols are supposed to demonstrate something has changed within me, and outwardly my life will follow. And yet at the same time, this is the struggle that we continue to have. We know that God has dealt with my sin. We know that the old has gone. And oftentimes, but Paul still struggles. He says, why do I still do what I shouldn't do? I do what I do. I don't do the things that I don't do. I do, and the things that I should do, I don't. And you and I understand that continually today. So Abraham, your outward sign of this covenant is that you're going to be circumcised, and all the males in your household will be circumcised. At the same time, then in verse 15, Sarah, her name gets changed from Sarai to Sarah. It's the idea of being a princess to being the mother of the nations, from being barren to having a child. And so let me reiterate the promise, Sarah. You think that on a technicality from the last chapter, you think that on a technicality, maybe God was promising Abram that through Abram there would be offspring. Well, let me just reaffirm my promise to you, Sarah. At this point, you're the one who's going to have a baby. You're the one who's going to have it. And in verse 17, it says that Abraham laughed. And that's a funny thing, obviously, because there's this image of a 99-year-old man with his 90-year-old wife, and somehow, God, you're going to bring about a child. I would probably cynically laugh too. But actually, what we understand is that this is actually not a cynical laughter. This is actually an example of Abraham's faith. Because Sarah, she would laugh later on in Scripture when the announcement of her son would come. She would laugh cynically, and she gets rebuked for it. Abraham doesn't get rebuked here, and I think that's part of it, is that we would understand that Abraham's laughter here is not a cynical one. It's actually one of joy and believing God. Again, walk with me in faith. Be blameless, God is instructing him. Okay, I will. I'm excited, God. Take me on this journey. I'm ready. And he's excited. He said, God, you're promising this? All right, I'm going to believe you. This is Abraham's continued journey of faith. He's taking a few more steps forward, trusting God, believing in God. And so he laughs. And so, God, you're going to do what you do, and I'm going to trust you. I want to take a step back for us and just imagine this. We know that is something we're supposed to say. We know that is something we're supposed to live by. That God, you're going to do what you do, and I'm going to follow in faith. But a lot of times how we practically live is, God, I'm going to do what I want to do, and God, somehow you need to bless what I do instead. May I just suggest that we take Abraham's way, just to trust God. God, you do what you're going to do, and I'm going to follow in faith. Rather than do it our way, which is, God, I'm going to do what I do, and I hope that somehow you fit into my plan. Because the term Isaac actually means to laugh, and Abraham is laughing because he's trusting in God. He's joyful, he's ready to go. God, you do what you do, and I will follow. And so this is where we end this part of Genesis chapter 17. We're left hanging here now. This promise is coming. It's coming. He's been waiting for almost 25 years now. He started at 75 when God called him. He messed up just 13 years prior to this. Now at 99 years old, it's almost here. It's almost here. God, I'm ready. I'm ready to walk with you. I'm ready to go. How many of us can say that at 99 we'll be ready to do a new thing with God? How much can say at even 45 that many of us are really willing to do something new with God? But again, God calls us to walk faithfully and be blameless. May I encourage you, walk faithfully, which means, God, you do what you're supposed to do, and I'm going to trust and I'm going to follow you. And to be blameless, to live in such a way that we are always in plain view of God. But again, if we're living in such a way that says this, God, I'll do what I want to do, and you need to fit into my plan, may I ask you to reorient your thinking. God, you do what you do, and let me fit, let me follow in faith to your plans. Well, God bless you. Hope that's an encouragement. Hope that's a challenge to you. We will see you Sunday as we pick up Genesis chapter 18.